Today, I'm going to talk about how everybody worships something. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Okay, quick clarification. When I say worship, I want to be clear that I do not mean engages in formalized ritual worship. That obviously that's not the case. And so to jump into it, when I talk about worship, the concept of worship is often misunderstood, frankly. And I don't want to get too far into it. I need to get just a little bit in order to really make the meaning clear here. So there are, the word worship has been used in a variety of ways around similar subjects. So to give you an example, in the old English marriage rite in the Anglican Church, one of the things a person would say to the other is, "With my body I thee worship." And so you can see from that kind of usage of to worship somebody. Or you can see again where a person who really, really likes some sports figure and holds them up as the pinnacle of human achievement is described as worshiping this sports figure. But that doesn't mean that they engage in ritualized worship of the sports figure. The Anglican rite does not mean that that you use your body in order to take part in some ritualized worship. And moreover, in both of these cases, they do not preclude there being other objects of worship. Hence the "with my body," for example, as distinct from "with your soul," with all of you, in the Anglican rite. Or you can actually see it in a bunch of the, one of the addresses you could have to certain types of nobility and so on is like "your worship," which again indicates that there's a relationship going on where one person is being held up as higher than others, but it does not imply an exclusivity to it. And so this brings in all sorts of complicated things in debates that I don't want to get into. The thing about worship that I want to describe here is actually the exclusive aspect of it. That what worshiping means, so you can see that worshiping is holding up something as being higher and a thing in some sense to be emulated and a thing towards which some things are directed. So the ritualized aspect of worship exists in order to remind yourself of the greater height of this object of the worship. The act. So in this sense, the act of worship is to remind yourself, to call to mind the correct ordering of things. So here, sort of borrowing language a little bit from Jordan Peterson, who's very useful because he is essentially a secular person who has tried very hard to understand the things that religious people understand and to bring this understanding, to make this understanding accessible to people essentially of a materialist mindset, a materialist in the sense of like matter is all that there is. There's no actual coherent definition of materialism, so don't worry about energy and fields and whatnot. Basically, sometimes they're called naturalists or whatever. There's no coherent definition. Don't worry about it. But the point is, since Jordan Peterson more or less is in that mindset, although he is open to the possibility that there is more than just the material world, but he generally seems like he can't really believe it, and so he's trying to bring as much of this wisdom over as possible. And so he developed some interesting terminology for doing this, because when you talk to religious people and you say like everybody worships something, they just all know what you mean. And there's no problem, there's no difficulty, there's no misunderstanding about it for the most part. But secular people often do not understand at all because they don't do anything where they consciously choose to worship something with their rational mind, as a sort of formal act. And so they don't really, because they don't do it, they don't really notice what it's about and they don't get the idea. So he's good at this sort of thing. And so some terminology that I'm kind of borrowing from him for this purpose is what he describes as the hierarchy of being, or the hierarchy of goods. And that is to say, if you hold that there are good things at all, And if you hold that some of these things are more important than other things, such if they come into conflict, one of these will be sacrificed for another. So, if you have, you use the silly philosophical trolley problems, right? Like, you've got a trolley line. On the one hand, you have a an ant, and on the other you have, a person tied down to the rails, and you can divert the trolley such that the trolley crushes the ant and not the person. Most people would say, like, yep, you should do this because the person is more valuable than the ant. There are some asterisks about this, but I'm kind of going to be, even though it's wrong and incoherent, I'm going to be largely talking in consequentialist terms because most of the people who have difficulty with this sort of thing are consequentialists. So most people would say, like, yep, the person, the ant is good and the person is good, but the person is more good than the ant, so that where these two goods come into conflict, the person wins. Now, this is obviously a highly contrived thing, but you make these kind of decisions all of the time. If you are going to read a book, there are many, many books, and you have to pick one of them, and you have to not read other books in order to read this book, so that you have established some hierarchy of what is valuable to be spending your time on with this book. If you go to college, you have to pick college courses, you have to pick a major, you have to decide, like, what is better than other things given a limited amount of time and resources, and that I should devote these things there. If you are giving money to charities, you have to pick from among the charities, and so you have to figure out, like, which of these things is more deserving of this. When you, for example, if a person wrongs you and then apologizes, you have to determine between yourself and them. For example, when they apologize but they can't fix it, so like they broke something of yours and they are sorry that they broke it but they can't fix it, do you keep on holding this against them because there is a debt here that has not been repaid, or do you repay this debt and do you essentially repay the debt to yourself by forgiving this debt? That is to say, by that's essentially by saying, like, I am canceling out the debt that you owe me, and I am restoring our relationship by canceling out the debt that you owe me myself, since I can do it and you can't at the moment, or for the foreseeable future or whatever, and I will repair the relationship. And you have to choose here which is better, the repaired relationship or the debt actually being paid. They're two goods, and you have to choose which of these things is more valuable. Do you forgive, or do you, I forget which hand I used, or do you not forgive? I think I got that right. And so that's the nature of a hierarchy of goods. These things always come into, goods always in this world come into conflict with each other. You can choose to do only one thing, and in doing one thing, you're not doing everything else. Sometimes you can do it later, sometimes you can push things off. But in that case, you're just changing the problem from, if you can do three things and they're all good, you still have to choose, like, which one should be done now versus which should be done later, factoring in the possibility of being left undone and so forth. Now, something I want to point out. Before I point that thing out, the thing about having this hierarchy of goods is, since things are more important than others, for all things, they must have some relationship here, or you're going to be incoherent. Now, of course, you don't have to have thought this whole thing out. You just have to be able to, if presented with something, rank these things relative to each other in a rationally consistent way, or else you are irrational. Now, it is possible to not do this, to just sort of like randomly pick things like, today I will value reading books and tomorrow I'll burn down the books and the day after I'll value reading books again. You can be like that. You can be random. You're not going to be distinguishable from being mentally ill, but you can do that. So when I talk about everybody worships something, what I mean is all people who are attempting to live a rationally consistent life worship something. And that is most people. Most people do try. They don't always try very hard. And another thing you have to bear in mind is that people fail. People make mistakes. People do things wrong. So people will believe, that one thing is more important than another, but act contrary to it. People will believe it, but in the moment they can't bring themselves to act upon the thing that they know, because in the immediate moment they are they can see the good of the one too much, and they can't see the other good, and so they give in. For example, addicts who know that they are hurting somebody by like getting drunk and not showing up to do the thing that they promised to do for a person who is valuable to them. They know that keeping their word and helping the person that they said they would help is much more important than the pleasure of being drunk, or the solace of being drunk, or whatever exactly it is in the drunkenness that really is calling out to them. But in the moment, it calls out to them so clearly, and the other thing is far away and they can't see it. And even though intellectually they know it, the one evidence is so clear, and the other requires them to be able to recognize the truth of a thing where the evidence is not in front of their face at the moment. That is to say, have faith. But in any event, and so they give in even though they know it. So people do not always do what they know to be correct. They do not always do what they believe to be correct. I actually have a video on this, by the way, titled, if memory serves, Nobody Believes Their Beliefs. That is to say, all human beings fail according to what they know to be true. People do not, in fact, act according to what they know all of the time. And that's called... this is essentially... this is what's called sin. This is the fact that people don't do this is, the cause of this is original sin. This is what those terms refer to. But the point here, you don't need to recognize those terms or be willing to apply them. I'm just letting you know what they mean because it's kind of useful here. So the point is, in spite of the fact that people are not completely coherent, people are not completely rational. To do what you know to be less good is irrational, and that's why sin is irrational. That's why it's doing wrong. So bear in mind when I talk about this, and when we say that like all people worship something, we don't mean that they are perfectly devoted to it and never vary from this thing. So to worship something, as I said, is to hold something high. And so you have a hierarchy of goods, and so there's something at the top. There's something that will give way to nothing, where everything else, if it comes into conflict, must be sacrificed for that thing, because that is better than all other things. Using thing, not implying physicality to thing here. So that is the thing that you worship. In this sense, that thing at the top of your hierarchy of goods, if you don't live a completely irrational, incoherent life, you will have some hierarchy of goods, and that will imply a thing at the top. A place where a lot of people go wrong, by the way, because they are consequentialists. Consequentialism is holding that an action is moral or immoral on the basis of the consequences of that action. The problem, consequentialism, it's popular, but it's also completely incoherent in that nobody knows what the consequences of their actions are. You can sort of, depending on what the actions are, you can kind of guess at the immediate, you can have a fairly good idea depending on the immediate things, and sometimes a decent idea of, right afterwards. So like, you push a boulder, you've got a pretty darn good idea, off a cliff, you've got a pretty good idea that it'll fall. You may or may not know who it's going to hit when it lands. When you release an arrow, it's going forward, almost certainly, unless something breaks. And you've got a decent idea of about where it's going to hit, but, every time you do, you have to watch to see where the arrow actually lands, because you never quite know exactly where it's going to hit. Those are things that are very predictable. Some actions are a lot less predictable than that. And then the second order and the third order and the fourth order effects. And as these things spiral down, nobody can see. But your decision, according to consequentialism, is based upon all of those things. So the overwhelming majority of what determines whether an action is good or bad, according to consequentialism, simply is unknowable. So you can't actually evaluate anything according to consequentialism. So consequentialism always devolves into picking whatever you can foresee and just deciding, good enough, even though I know that this is the minority of what's actually going to be resulting. So most people aren't really consequentialists. But they think they are. That's a story for another day. The point here is that a lot of what people misunderstand, or people who are consequentialists will look at possible choices, like, do I give this person money or not? Do I study this or not, or what have you? And mistake, they can't, when they look at it, they can't even they do not find intelligible the almost immediate consequences of their action. So like, let's say you throw a rock over a wall. Well, I have no idea what's there, so I have no idea what's going to happen. Like, I know the rock's going to go over the wall, but after that, I don't even know. Distinct from shooting an arrow at a target you can see, because you at least have some initial idea of what's going to happen. The point here being that confusion. I don't know what the consequences will be, so I can't evaluate which one of these two things has the better or worse consequences. That has nothing to do with whether or not you have a hierarchy of goods. That just has to do with whether or not you can see what it is that you are doing. That's just a question of fact. Like, if you have a glass that you're, liquid that you're giving to somebody, and I don't know what's in it. It could be water, it could be poison. I haven't got a clue. Should I give it to the person? That fact that you have no idea what's in it, in consequence what it will do, and so whether or not this would be good or evil to do, has nothing to do with whether or not you know that giving a drink of water to the thirsty is good, and giving a drink of sulfuric acid to the thirsty is bad. You have the hierarchy of goods, you just don't know what you're actually dealing with, so you can't consult your hierarchy of goods. And so you have to keep those two things clear. An awful lot of moral ambiguity or moral indecision doesn't come from having an unclear hierarchy of goods. It comes from an unclear understanding of the circumstances. That's not at all relevant to whether or not a person has a hierarchy of goods and in consequence something at the top of a hierarchy of goods. So even though that's going to be most of what people take to be moral ambiguity, you have to understand that has nothing to do with the question whatever. So, whether you're talking about atheists or Christians or Jews or Buddhists or Hindus or whatever, most people try to live in some fairly rational way. They don't always look like it if you don't understand what their hierarchy of goods is. They often cannot tell you what their hierarchy of goods is. Some people can. Religious people in general can, because like one of the things about a religion is you've taken the time to formalize it out in some sense so that you can answer, in fact, like God is the greatest good. And you've sort of done the thinking ahead of time and the studying ahead of time so you can actually give coherent answers. And so that's sort of one of the benefits of a religion, in the same sense that like you can study physics without ever having learned anything. You can do all experiments for yourself and have no terminology to describe it and be kind of unable to describe it. But if you go to school, you will actually be able to describe the various experiments that you've well, you don't do experiments in school, but let's pretend for the moment that in school people actually do experiments rather than just relying purely on human testimony about what happens if you do these experiments. You can have terminology to describe it. Any sort of formal system, be it religious, be it educational, be it the police, one of the benefits of any formal system is that you have a terminology with which to describe things, and you will have answers to some of the most obvious questions that are around, as opposed to an informal system where you may well not have any sort of coherent answer because you may not have even been particularly posed with a question before. So that is kind of the benefit, but the point is whether or not you can describe these things, you will still have this hierarchy of goods, because without it, you don't even have a reason to get up in the morning. If you can't compare two things and find out whether they're better or worse, well, why would you get out of bed? It's positive action. Why should you? Now, you can, be a complete madman, just get up because you feel like it, go back into bed because you feel like it, etc. But for the most part, people, that doesn't tend to lead to survival. So people tend to have some sort of rational ordering of, the things that lead to survival, such as, if you're a farmer actually tending your farm, if you're a hunter going and hunting, or if you're, in a complex economy going to your job and earning money so you can buy food, etc. These things are all better than just lying around in bed all day. And almost everybody holds things like this. And the thing is, as I said, even though you will find plenty of people who couldn't tell you what their hierarchy is, they actually do kind of have it because they all, for the most part, have ideas about things like when is killing justified and unjustified, and various other related questions to that. Like what, okay, now that you've, been fed, what do you do now? Now that you've taken care of that. Maslow's hierarchy of needs is, think what you want of it, but it's an example of how like people do tend to answer certain questions after certain other questions have been satisfied. And the thing is, people tend for the most part to be pretty, like to get up that. Very few people are, a few minutes away from starving to death every single minute of their life. So, people do actually have these things. The big thing is they can't tell you a lot of the time, but they have them. And I'm trying to think if I want to there's a quote I want to bring in from Chesterton, that if you don't do philosophy yourself, you're not going to have the advantage of the brute beasts and have no philosophy. You're going to have the used up scraps of somebody else's philosophy. And so you will absorb this hierarchy of goods from somewhere. Possibly what you're taught as a child, possibly what you're, influenced by friends or what have you. But you're going to absorb it from somewhere, and you're going to use it inconsistently, but you're going to use it when it comes up. And so your life is going to be directed towards something you perceive to be good. And, you'll miss your mark as you're aiming for it. That's, we're fallen creatures is the actual thing, but, we're imperfect creatures. So you're going to miss your mark, but you've got a mark you're aiming towards. And you may not realize it, may not be able to say it, but you do. It may not be a very impressive mark. A lot of people's lives are aimed, roughly speaking, towards just having a lot of pleasure. And that's really what they hold to be the highest good. They're incredibly unimpressive. They tend to be boring and uninteresting people. They don't have much in the way of conversations. They often will show up online just to complain about things because they have nothing of actual interest to say because they don't study anything or, find things particularly interesting. But yeah, a lot of people do have that. And so in that sense, they worship pleasure. Not that they have formalized rituals where they bow down to pleasure, but rather their life is directed towards this as the highest good, where everything else must give way. Now, many of them, it's a little bit confusing because they sort of have a long-term maximization of pleasure rather than the immediate short-term, I'm just going to stuff myself with as many candy bars as I possibly can, maximization of pleasure. But that's just holding that the long-term maximization of the like complete maximization of pleasure, not the short-term, immediate maximization of pleasure followed by lots of suffering, but rather the full-on maximization of pleasure is what they hold to be the highest good. And so they're crafty about how do you maximize your pleasure? How do you get as much pleasure as you can, given that you're going to have to do things like hold a job, etc. But like for a lot of people, this is basically the highest good that they can recognize, really. And they'll depending on how it works, they will often sacrifice an awful lot, especially if they don't have to endure looking at it. They will throw countless other people's lives away just in the maximization of this. And usually it doesn't come down to that, but you want to see that, study German economics in the 1930s and 40s. And it's sort of that writ large. Like people wanted stuff. People wanted to be happy, and so the in order to keep them happy, Germany went on a major murder and theft spree throughout much of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. It happens. I mean, it's rare for it to happen on such a large scale. It's kind of why that example stands out so much. But at the same time, being on a much smaller scale doesn't mean it's not the same thing. It just means circumstances aren't conducive to making it nearly so big. So, tiny asteroids that hit the Earth are still asteroids, even though they're not, the, extinction event level asteroids. They're just smaller, but they're same thing, same kind of thing. So, that, I think I've answered most of the questions I think would reasonably come up about this. So that's what's meant by all people worship something. All people's lives are directed towards something as the highest good, towards which, when goods are in conflict, all else must be sacrificed for the sake of that. And now, of course, something I didn't mention is that, of course, people don't, just because something is the highest good doesn't mean you want other things to conflict with it. You don't want that. You would like to be able to have lesser goods as well as higher goods. A hierarchy of goods does not mean a monomaniacal exclusion of all goods besides the highest good. It just means that there is this hierarchy, and when they conflict, you have to choose. Not that they necessarily conflict, or that you would choose one over another when they don't conflict. So I want to clarify that too, because some people just like to oversimplify, and will if you present something like a hierarchy, they'll say, aha, so that hierarchy actually is one thing. Like, no, it's a hierarchy. It's many things. There's a relationship between them. The existence of a relationship between them doesn't mean they're all one thing in some sense. So that's the sense in how everybody worships something. Religious people, non-religious people, atheists, everybody worships something. That is to say, everybody's life is directed towards some good as the highest good. Or they're just completely incoherent and irrational. But at the same time, nobody, be it religious people or non-religious people or atheists, also hits the mark 100% of the time. So just because you have this highest good doesn't mean that you always all of your actions are actually directed at it. People make mistakes and fail. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.